Welcome back. As I know, we've been doing this every 2 weeks. Today is going to be a little bit of a departure from what we've done in the past. It's going to all be about how to set up Wi-Fi with StayFi to have the best results for both you and your guests. And we're going to go over a lot of different scenarios that we see from our customers and how we go about optimizing the Wi-Fi in their properties. Just a little background before we jump in. We have two upcoming sessions. In 2 weeks, we're going to be going deep into how to master StayFi's homepage feature. And we're going to go into content, messaging, upselling, and we actually will cover a new feature that will help get your homepage in front of even more guests so they can engage with upsells even prior to the stay. So we'll be covering that feature in our upcoming September 3rd session. And then on September 17th, I'm really excited to unveil the next iteration of StayFi's email marketing tool. So this is building upon what we have already, but we're going to have new and awesome ways to create compelling content that will get your past guests to book with you again and again. And we'll show you all the new ways we've built to help you create those emails. So if you've been wondering, how do I use email more effectively? Or maybe you've been intimidated by setting up your first emails, definitely come on September 17th, as we're going to show you how to use our new tool and walk you through all the updates we have. So I'm really excited about that. And then again, if you want to watch a replay of this session or see a replay of any of our past sessions, those are all available on StayFi's YouTube channel. And then finally, I'm really thrilled today. I'm also joined by our CTO, Adam, as today's content is going to be more technical in nature. He's going to be here to chime in on certain issues and then, of course, to answer your questions when we get to the end. And when it comes to questions, please make sure you use the Q&A section of Zoom, not the chat section, just so we can keep track of all your questions and answer them as we go along. So today's agenda, number one, kind of go over some reasons why Wi-Fi quality matters. It's probably a given for most of you, but we'll cover some areas maybe you hadn't thought of. Second is understanding the different hardware options that are out there for Wi-Fi and why we at StayFi use primarily Ubiquiti UniFi devices for our service. The third is how do you pick the right Wi-Fi hardware? And in our case, our hardware or the UniFi hardware are called access points, and we'll cover what those are and how to use them. The fourth section will be how to set up mesh networks in properties to get coverage over larger areas. Then we're going to go over how to optimize access point placement. So AP is shorthand for access points, and I'll even explain what an access point is if that's confusing lingo for you. As how you place these devices in the property. It actually can make a big impact on the coverage and speed in your homes or condos or other locations. Then we'll look at some common Wi-Fi issues, and then finally we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. So why does Wi-Fi setup and configuration matter? Number one is that having great Wi-Fi will improve your guest satisfaction. And the second point here is having bad Wi-Fi, we know can be a big driver of low or poor reviews. Wi-Fi is pretty much a necessity, an expectation in short-term rentals. So it's something that you have to have, and not having it is a big driver of poor reviews, which we know can make a huge difference on conversion on OTAs or your own website. Also, having a seamless Wi-Fi experience can be a great reason why someone wants to come back and rebook your property and stay there again and again. So you definitely need to have a seamless experience. And it's not just the speed and coverage of the Wi-Fi, it's also how easy was the Wi-Fi to join? Did it require searching for some complicated password that's very hard to enter in? So all of these things go into creating a great guest Wi-Fi experience for everyone in your property. Also, important to keep in mind all the other devices that are online in the property and how do you maintain those connections. So whether it's TVs, thermostats, door locks, other devices that require Wi-Fi, how can you make sure those are always online so that your guests can use those amenities in your property without confusion or without issues. So when it comes to hardware options, StayFi has partnered with a company called Ubiquiti to do our Wi-Fi equipment. And why is Ubiquiti UniFi great devices for Wi-Fi? Number one is it allows us to use our custom branded splash page product. So only certain types of devices can support these splash pages that we use to gate the internet to collect guest data. And UniFi is one of the hardware brands that can support third-party companies like StayFi writing this type of software to create these splash pages that you can use to collect guest data. Number two is that UniFi allows for remote monitoring of Wi-Fi devices at scale. So we can do things like occupancy alerting to let you know if there's too many guests in a property, as well as outage alerting to let you know when the internet both goes offline and online. So we can do all that remote monitoring and management from one screen. And the third is because we are experts in Ubiquiti UniFi, we can provide 7-day a week personalized support, something you're not going to find pretty much anywhere else because we're really experts in this hardware and we've seen just about every scenario you can imagine under the sun. So we can help you out if you have any issues with your equipment. And one that's not here is that a lot of hospitality locations that are not traditional vacation rentals, but things like motel conversions, small hotels, venues like wedding venues. We work with a lot of places. Ubiquiti UniFi is already installed, and we can work with UniFi equipment anywhere. And a lot of kind of tech savvy individuals have also installed UniFi or Ubiquiti UniFi equipment in their rentals. So we see things like Dream Machines, other Wi-Fi equipment from Ubiquiti, and we can connect with any of that hardware if you already have it in your short-term rental or other type of hospitality location. And when is Ubiquiti a great choice? If you manage large properties, so you need meshing or you're planning on growing your inventory and want standardization. If you're interested in obviously collecting guest data, and then finally, if you want to simplify the management of your properties. So there's some very cool things that we do with Ubiquiti UniFi that again, you're not going to find with other types of equipment. Things like we can set one standard set of guest Wi-Fi names across all your properties. So you only need one set of instructions that you tell all guests, no matter what home they're in, to join the Wi-Fi. You can keep your existing internet running in your home so that old devices or old, existing equipment like TVs can stay on those networks. It doesn't disrupt your homeowner network. So there's lots of great reasons why Ubiquiti is a great option in short-term rentals. There are other hardware options that we don't work with. So this is kind of a slide that describes maybe when StayFi is not the best option. So you can use things like your internet provider's router modem. We see things like Eros, Google Wi-Fi, TP-Link devices. And might this be a good fit and not to go with something like Ubiquiti UniFi if you manage a small property like a one-bedroom unit? And so maybe collecting guest data there isn't as important to you. If you're not trying to build a brand and are okay with all bookings coming through OTAs, if you're fine with that, if you want to be 100% Airbnb, then you don't need to worry about collecting data or branding your short-term rental listing as something that's not Airbnb, right? Because that splash page allows you to differentiate yourself from an OTA and build brand awareness with your guests. If you don't need to manage properties at scale, you can manage one or two networks provided by, these different types of devices, and they can be different, and you don't need one pane or one window to see the status of all of these devices. And then also, if you don't want to spend any money on additional Wi-Fi equipment, that's totally fine. There's just going to be more limitations about what you can do with it. And what's important to note is that you can have these other types of systems running in a property. And then when you purchase one of our Ubiquiti UniFi access points, it plugs into, let's say, your existing router modem from your ISP or your internet service provider. And we're just layering a new guest network on top of your existing one. And so you can actually leave your existing network running and all your guests are joining this new network that we are broadcasting from the StayFi device. I think we talk less about the Wi-Fi related benefits of StayFi. but it's something to note. We cover that in our customer testimonials. I know we're very leaning in constantly to direct bookings, building brand, collecting data, but customers, especially as they get larger, the Wi-Fi related benefits are a huge reason about why they are using StayFi and are using StayFi to scale across more properties. So Cole Akai here, they noticed that, while they quickly increased from 20 to 30% of all their bookings coming directly, they also saw that Wi-Fi related tickets plummeted 75% in the properties where they added StayFi. A few reasons for this. Number one set of guest Wi-Fi instructions really simplify getting onto Wi-Fi for guests. Two, in this case, they decide not to have a password because they're managing single family homes. So guests just join the Kolakai guest network. They get greeted with the splash page and they can proceed right online. They don't need to fish around guest instructions or look for a manual or a booklet to find some complicated password for just this property. Stay Duvet had a similar experience. Well, yes, they're seeing a ton of new direct bookings because of the data they're collecting and marketing they're doing. They also saw a huge decrease in the number of Wi-Fi support calls. So they're saving over 200 hours per year. And the reason is they can see the status of the internet across all their properties at any time and get alerted as to when the internet goes off or online. That means that they can see, for instance, where internet is offline between stays and make sure that they are going to that property during the turn and addressing the internet issue, which could be anything from guests unplugging it, an ISP issue, different reasons why the internet might be offline, but we're giving you visibility into that at scale so that you can do something about it before new guests arrive and have potentially a negative experience. Also nice is you can see, let's say internet goes down across 30 properties at the same time. Then it's very easy to see that there's probably an ISP outage or a power outage. So by seeing status across all your properties, it's pretty easy to see if there's something bigger going on that has nothing to do with you, or if it's something that's just this property and therefore something that you should go and look at between guest stays if that's an option for you. So when it comes to getting started with StayFi, and I mentioned before we work with these Ubiquiti UniFi devices, there are different devices to choose from. And so kind of going from left to right, I'll cover what we recommend for based on square footage. And I'm going to cover in the next few slides, there's a lot of caveats to this, i.e. construction materials, layout of the property, how much coverage do you need versus, what you could potentially max out at. So there's lots of reasons why you might not pick something that falls into this range. So these are just general recommendations as to what we recommend. On the left here, we have two devices that are good for smaller properties under around 1,500 square feet. One is the 6 Plus, and the other is the Wi-Fi 5 indoor-outdoor unit. Now, the key difference here is the Wi-Fi 5 indoor-outdoor unit is very good at broadcasting kind of horizontally around it, but does not broadcast well vertically. So we only recommend this device for one-story properties, but is the cheapest device we sell for $99. So it's definitely great for single-story condos or single-story smaller units where you want to buy something that will provide fast Wi-Fi, but is at the cheaper end. The 6 Plus is good for multi-story properties, so that's kind of a little more expensive than the Wi-Fi 5 device. And then when you get to the mid-size and larger properties, we're going to move over to another device that we call the 6 Long Range. That's the most expensive device that we sell. One of those is great for our properties up to 2,000 square feet. And then when you get larger than 2,000 square feet, that might be a time where you want to consider getting a mesh device. Now, there's a lot of cases, and I'll talk about this in a second. If a property is 2,200 square feet, you don't necessarily need two devices. It's just to note that the 6 Long Range will cover around 2,000 square feet. Maybe there is a bathroom in the top right corner of the home where if the Wi-Fi coverage is mediocre and not super fast, that works for your situation. So just because your property is a certain square footage size, it doesn't mean you need to have Wi-Fi coverage that covers every last inch of the home. And that's again really comes up to you as a property owner or manager, kind of like what is your goal when it comes to Wi-Fi coverage. But if you want to achieve more coverage, you would get 2 of these 6 long-range devices, and they mesh automatically together, and then you can scale that mesh pretty much infinitely. So you can add a 3rd device, a 4th device. It's also important to note that all of these devices mesh with each other. So maybe if you just want to achieve slightly more coverage in one area, you could get a long range and a 5 indoor/outdoor. So there is a little more economical way to go about meshing if you're just looking for a smaller boost in one area and maybe don't need 2 of the most expensive devices. So again, it's going to be situation dependent, layout dependent, but these are our general recommendations when it comes to coverage. So these are, again, some of those consideration points I just talked about. Do you actually need 100% coverage of the home, including far-reaching areas? If you know that your guests are going to spend 80% of the time in the living area and the bedrooms, maybe you don't need coverage in certain areas, and that's a compromise that you're willing to make. Maybe today you have just the ISP modem router. You're going to put the long range in. That's going to probably give you a little more coverage. And so there are areas of the home that were never covered before, and they're still not going to be covered. Maybe you're just getting a little more coverage by upgrading to the long range to broadcast beside your current modem router combination unit. So again, that's totally up to you. Do you want to cover outdoor areas? That's an important consideration. Maybe that's not an area that's covered today that you want to add. So for instance, you can add a second device on the inside of the building near this outdoor area and mesh it, with the other indoor device. Or you can even hardwire additional units outside, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's one thing to think about. Do you need the absolute fastest speeds or just enough for normal web browsing? Yeah, so maybe you're getting coverage in the whole home, but it's a little slower in the further out areas from the access point. But most of the time, that's still going to be good enough for guests because you actually don't need that much bandwidth for Netflix, email, mobile apps. So we see this a lot where people say, hey, I'm getting 200 megs here, but I'm only getting 50 megs in these bedrooms. 50 megabytes per second in these other areas of the home, that's going to be more than fast enough to do just about anything a guest would want to do on the internet. So I wouldn't really necessarily need to worry about that. One other consideration is, do guests have good cellular coverage in your area? That's something where maybe you don't need Wi-Fi in the deck, patio, or pool area because when guests are on their phone out there, they're going to be fine just using cellular coverage, and Wi-Fi just really needs to be focused in the home. So that's just one other thing to think about is there any utility to adding Wi-Fi to, let's say, an outdoor space when the reality is guests are going to be using cell phones and they'll be good with cellular coverage in those areas. Shape and construction is something to consider. You can have a 1-story building and 3-story building that are the same square footage, but they would have different needs. So for instance, if the modem router is in the center of your large 1-story building, one long-range device might cover the whole thing. But when it comes to a 3-story building, maybe even though it has the same square footage, it's not going to be able to reach up to the 3rd floor. So you might want to consider adding extender on the 2nd floor. That's why it's important to remember that the square footage are just guidelines, they're not absolutes, and it's going to depend both on the shape of the building as well as the construction materials. And also the placement of where the internet comes into the home, right? So if the internet modem router is in the middle of the home, you're going to get great coverage around it. If it's in the corner of the home, maybe you're going to need an extender to reach the entire property if that's a goal of yours. And then if you already have a mesh system in place and you want to add StayFi to that property, the number of devices you have in your mesh system, and if that's working well for you, is a good proxy for how many StayFi devices you need. So if you have an Eero and you need 2 extenders to cover this 4,000 square foot property, you'll probably need 3 StayFi access points to get similar coverage. And so that's a good proxy. Although I would say sometimes people place too many mesh devices in their home, and that can actually hurt Wi-Fi speeds, which we'll talk about in a second. So how does building a mesh network work with StayFi? So what's great about our devices is that they mesh automatically. So you don't need to do any extra configuration or syncing. When you plug the second device into power, it will automatically mesh with the first device that is hardwired. So you can see in this diagram here to the right, we have one device plugged into the modem router, and then we have 3 others that are plugged into power, and they're all gonna mesh with the closest device automatically. So there's no need for extra configuration. And then in the StayFi portal, you'll actually see the mesh strength, and we will tell you if you should place them a little closer together or if they're too far apart. So we'll give you a read on how good that mesh is within StayFi so you know if you set them up appropriately. It's also important to know that one device always must be hardwired. So you cannot mesh a StayFi device with your network being broadcast from your modem router. It must be hardwired to your modem router, but then the other devices that you add can be meshed to the first StayFi device. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, as some people do get a little confused by that sometimes. There is another option when you don't need to mesh. With the StayFi access points, you can actually hardwire multiple devices back to one internet connection. This is a little bit more of an advanced setup, but it is the optimal setup for Wi-Fi speed and coverage. So every time you mesh a device, it's going to lose speed when you hop. But if you wire all your devices back to the internet, you'll receive the highest possible speed across all your devices. This is not an easy setup in a lot of properties because you don't have cable running through the walls that let you do this. But if it's something that is available in your location, whether it's a home or a small hotel or motel that you're converting, if you have the ability to hardwire all your access points back to the modem router, that's going to give you the best result. Often this is done through something called a switch. So in the bottom right here, you can see these are one of those scary utility closets you've probably come across. In this case here, those cables are all coming from something called a switch. And a switch basically allows you just to distribute the internet via hardwired connections all over your property. We see in a lot of luxury homes or homes in Florida, for instance, is very common to have this setup because it has to be built for hurricanes. They have very thick walls that sometimes homes already have cabling set up through the walls. And then you have these, as you see here on the right, the ability to plug an access point into one of these outlets, let's say, around the home. And this will actually give you much better speed and coverage than meshing. So if you have a property where hardwiring is an option, it's definitely the best way to go. However, if it's not available in a property, or let's say you purchased a home or looking to renovate it, it is something you typically would have to hire someone to help you with to set up a switch and then wire all the access points back to the switch and the internet connection, but it is going to give you the best possible outcome for speed and coverage in the property if you can do it. When it comes to mesh network, the advantage here is obviously you don't need to do the cabling between the first access point and the other access points, and it's very easy to play with. So definitely, let's say you have a property where you don't know whether you need meshing or not. You can bring 2 StayFi access points to that property, plug the first into the router, test it, see if there's an area of the home that needs more coverage, and then you can plug one of the second access point into power, test the mesh, and test the coverage. But what's great about these access points is because they can be hardwired or meshed. If you, let's say, don't need the second access point in this particular property, you can always take it and use it in a different property and reassign it to that one. So it's very easy to flexibly distribute these devices across homes because if you don't need it in one home as a mesh device, you can always repurpose it as a repeater in another home or as a wired access point in another property. The one issue when it comes to meshing is that construction materials and layout are important factors. So like I mentioned before, there are certain markets, like Florida is one where we see this a lot, where exterior walls or interior walls are incredibly thick, and it's very hard to mesh in those homes. Like the devices have to be much closer together. You might have a general sense of what homes are like in your area, and that's something to consider when you look at our square footage recommendations. Do you have properties where there are super thick walls and coverage is an issue, or do you have properties where that's not a problem and therefore you can, go to the higher end of that range? One thing to also know about the devices we sell is that orientation does matter. So like I mentioned before, the most common devices we sell are these UniFi devices that are these kind of circular discs. And you can see here in the right diagram is that they actually broadcast the most out of the sides and the top where that light is, and the least out of the back. So when you think about placement, it's good to either place a device on a ceiling. So you can see here it's broadcasting down, giving you coverage, or on the floor, near the floor, lower down so that it's broadcasting up and around. What can be negative is if, let's say, you have a two-story home and the internet's on the second story, and you place the device like this on this third diagram here, because this case, it's not broadcasting that much below the device. And so in this case, it actually would be best in a two-story scenario to actually place this device and on the ceiling and wire it to the router so that it's on the ceiling facing down. I've seen the case of like, for some reason it's one building, the internet came in at the attic and they had the AP sitting like how you would think, like one of these devices on its back. And just by flipping the device upside down, they were able to get coverage through the whole property, where before they only were getting coverage in like the top floor. So the orientation does matter. And so if you want to get more coverage, you want to just orient the top of the device and the side of the device towards the area you want the most coverage. And you want to make sure that the back of the device is facing the area that you want the least coverage. So that's just, I hope this diagram was helpful because I know this is one that can be a really quick fix if you've had coverage issues, just because orientation does matter. And then when it comes to the 5 device, which is the one on with the little antennas that we recommend for single story homes or condos. That one, it comes with mounting equipment, and we definitely recommend that you mount it on a wall. It comes with both like screw mounts and also like a sticky mount, so you don't have to mess with construction or anything like that, or screwing in anything. And that way that you can mount it on a wall and get the most optimal coverage possible. This is a diagram that goes a little bit into getting the most coverage with meshing, and this is going into placement. So placing wireless access points halfway between wired AP and where guests need coverage is important. So if you think about it, if two devices are meshing, you can't place the device where you have no coverage right now, because then it won't be able to mesh. So if you go to a property, you wire one device, and then you go to the other side of the home and there's no coverage there, you need to place the wireless or mesh device in between where you have coverage and where you don't have coverage, so that it's still in an area with coverage, and then it will extend the coverage to the area with no coverage. Right, so if you place the device where you already have no coverage, you're still going to have no coverage because it's not going to be able to mesh. So it has to be within range of the first device. And we see people plug the device in where they have no coverage. The mesh quality is very poor or it doesn't mesh at all. So just make sure you move it a little closer to the first device so that you can have overlapping signals, and that way you can extend the coverage to where you need it. Yep, and then here, just one thing is that you want to make sure that between the wired and wireless AP, there aren't very thick walls, like concrete, brick, metal. If that becomes insurmountable, it may be a case where you might have to run cabling from the modem router or a switch to the second device to get optimal coverage, or you're going to have to place them much closer together. Then when it comes to wired APs and where they are located with other devices, I know that we send 3-foot cables with every device that we sell. But that doesn't mean in certain scenarios you might actually want to go buy a longer Ethernet cable so that you can play around where that first device is located. Because if you have too many devices meshing together, that actually will lower the speed. So this is the case if you look at the right here where you see there's like 4 devices in one home. Every time you're meshing between devices, you're going to lose approximately 50% of the speed. So that's one thing that we see both with our devices and Eero or Google Wi-Fi devices is, especially with the Google and Eero ones, is you buy a pack of 5, and so you think you need to place all 5. but actually you're placing too many devices in the property, and it's actually slowing down the speed. So we always recommend start with one, assess the range and coverage, then place the second, and then see what the coverage looks like. Don't just assume you need 3, 4, 5 devices and place them all at the same time, because then you're probably going to place too many devices, and then that will actually degrade the speed and quality of the Wi-Fi. This again talks a little bit about property layout and construction. Um, the type of materials your property is made out of is gonna determine some of the elements when it comes to coverage. So obviously glass, air, open spaces, very easy to broadcast through. Wood drywall, medium. That's really where those like 1,500, 2,000 square foot recommendations come from. And then metal, concrete, brick, and then also in there things like cabins with crazy thick wood walls that are just beyond a regular wall, but like entire tree trunks basically in some cabins. That's where you're gonna have the least coverage from Wi-Fi. So in the case of the third scenario, right, uh, you may find that the best solution is to run cables through problematic walls. That's not always going to be possible, right? Um, so you may need to place the devices differently. So if there's a place where you can place the device where you can kind of get around the most troubling material in the property, if you can do that, um, before placing an AP or mounting it, make sure you test the coverage in a property. So if you're going to mount a device on a ceiling, make sure you kind of simulate that and see what the coverage looks like before you actually go ahead and mount it. And then if your router is in a kind of a basement or far end of the property, consider getting a much longer Ethernet cable than we provide and running it to a more central location so you can broadcast from there. So there's lots of things you can do to try to get around uh, types of materials that are very hard to broadcast through, but I know it is a very challenging scenario and there isn't always an easy solution other than running a cable or buying multiple access points to achieve the coverage you'd like. These are some common Wi-Fi issues we see across customers. And I just want to cover these quickly at the end here before we get to the Q&A. One is guests aren't seeing the splash page. Um, Number one reason people either aren't getting the data they'd like or guests are not getting the splash page is because guests are actually accessing the home's old Wi-Fi. So it's just important that you go through and audit all of your guest instructions, whether they're digital or physical things in the home, to make sure you're telling guests to join the StayFi guest network and not the main router's Wi-Fi network if that's still running. Also important that these networks have different names. Sometimes people get confused and they name their StayFi Wi-Fi network the same name as the home's original Wi-Fi. Then you're going to have two networks in the home with the same names, and that's also not going to work. So you want to make sure that the StayFi network has a new name. By default, it'll be the same name in all properties, and that you give guests the instructions to join that network and you remove all of the old instructions. If you don't remove the old instructions, then less guests will join your guest network. You'll collect less guest data, and that will defeat the whole purpose of adding StayFi to the property. Guests are being kicked off the network intermittently. Um, this is one where to make sure that your guest network name is different name than other networks. So, right, so if you have a home Wi-Fi network, make sure it's different name than the guest network, and definitely should not be the same as the main router's Wi-Fi network. Guests have slow speeds. That's really one where you want to test in the property when you set up StayFi just to make sure the speeds are what you'd like throughout the home and that the devices are placed optimally and oriented correctly. So that's where it goes back to those diagrams I was showing of you want to make sure that the top of the device and size of the device are oriented towards the place that you need coverage. And also if you are wireless meshing, that the mesh connection between the devices are good. If the mesh connection between your two devices is poor and our portal is telling you to place them closer, It means that it's still gonna extend the network, but the speeds from the second device are gonna be a lot slower. So by having that good mesh between the first and second device, you're gonna make sure that the speeds are maintained pretty well throughout the whole property. And we recommend using fast.com as the place to run your speed tests. And then finally, the monitoring and alerting tools in StayFi are not on automatically. You actually have to go into StayFi to both set up occupancy alerting, which you can do on the properties page, and then also Wi-Fi outage alerting you can do on the access points page. Make sure you turn those on and are alerting the relevant people for those different issues to make sure you know when the internet comes offline as well as when it goes back online. Because we do see, sometimes ISPs can have very quick outages, and so we want to make sure that you know that both, hey, it went offline and then it came back online, and that therefore the issue is now resolved. And so you can also set up the amount of time that you see that you want to be alerted. So I typically recommend like 30 minutes is a good to know whether it's offline. If you set that window very short, you're going to find that your internet service provider may have a lot of very small outages. Most people would not even notice them. It's just important to know that like we don't want to be bombarding you with outage alerts that aren't real. So I would set a little bit more of a 30 plus minutes on the offline alerting so that you're actually being notified of real outages and not ones that are very temporary. And then finally, through the StayFi portal, you can get the network help that you need when it comes to both setting up properties and maintaining your networks. And our support team is available 7 days a week during US business hours via email and phone. So if you are having issues in particular properties, if you're not sure how to set up Wi Fi in a property, or you need help meshing in property, or even just need advice when it comes to setting up more complicated networks. So let's say you took over a building and you need to wire multiple devices, we actually have a full-time network engineer on StayFi's team, in addition to our support folks that can help with more complex networking needs. So don't hesitate to reach out to our support team to work with your specific Wi-Fi issue. As you can imagine, we work in tens of thousands of properties all over the world. We've seen just about every scenario under the sun. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, since we can definitely help you with your StayFi setup and wireless access points. Just to summarize what we went over today, uh, reliable and fast Wi-Fi is a must-have for just about any short-term rental in the world, and it's going to benefit you not just satisfaction, positive reviews, but it's also going to reduce the costs on your end to support all of those properties and reduce the number of tickets you're getting. We work with Ubiquiti UniFi devices because they're reliable, scalable, and most importantly, that you can manage them remotely. So you can manage tens, hundreds, thousands of these devices from one window through StayFi. And of course, we offer all the built-on services with StayFi when it comes to captive portals and alerting, everything beyond what UniFi comes with natively that make it ideal for short-term rentals. Make sure you pick the right devices based on the size and construction of your properties. I personally always lean into something more robust. So I, typically recommend those 6 long-range devices, which I know can be a little more pricey. But that just means you're going to get the most coverage, get coverage maybe in some outdoor areas that you weren't before, to really maximize the experience for your guests. If you're not seeing the results you want from the StayFi access points, definitely consider placement and orientation. So again, orienting the kind of disc with the light towards the place where you're going to have the most guests, and the back of the device toward the area with the least number of guests to maximize coverage in a property. And also, when placing a mesh device, check the portal when you do that to make sure that the connection is good, because if the connection isn't good, you're going to see reduced speeds from that mesh device. And then finally, make sure you take advantage of the alerting tools in StayFi, both occupancy and outage, so that you will know if there's any issues, whether there's 30 guests in a property and there shouldn't be, as well as whether internet goes offline in a home and it isn't resolved between stays, so that when folks are in the property uh, doing the turn, they can make sure to check the Wi-Fi equipment and get the internet back online before new guests arrive. Now I will go ahead and we can turn it over to the Q&A. Uh, I'll just go through some of the answered ones first. So, can we get a recording of this? Yes. And Yvonne shared the link to our YouTube channel where this will be published as well as all the other previous sessions. Someone asked if they have two homes together, can I mesh them together? The Wi-Fi's already overlap each other. Um, so I'd say answer this in two ways. One is if you keep the internet subscription in both homes and you plug the StayFi device into each one, it will create one giant Wi-Fi network. So if you have the guest network Whitney guest, and then you're in one property and you join it and you walk over to the other property, your cell phone or computer will just switch seamlessly between access points. Now, when it comes to meshing them together so that you can go down to only one internet subscription, that's definitely a risky option for a few reasons. One is if you're renting these properties separately and one guest in one property unplugs the internet, it's going to take the internet offline in the other property, and you may not be able to access the first property to fix it. So when it comes to meshing between properties to reduce the amount you're spending on internet, it's definitely consider the downside if the internet gets disrupted in one property and having it take the internet down in the other. So it's good to always have some redundancy or backup when it comes to coverage or internet connections and sharing internet to make sure that you're not losing internet in one property because of what a guest does in another, and you can't access that first property to fix it. Someone asked if StayFi can work with a NiFi hotspot, and I'll give a general answer for any router, whether it's Starlink to hotspots to T-Mobile hotspots. We need an Ethernet port to plug StayFi into that device. So when it comes to, let's say, Starlink, those routers don't have an Ethernet port, but they have an adapter they sell, which I know is very annoying, in order to connect an Ethernet port to it. So you can get an adapter for your Starlink device. Some of these hotspots have maybe UBC ports that, again, you can get an adapter for Ethernet cable. So there just needs to be some way to plug Ethernet in, whether it's through an adapter or natively into the router. So as long as it's possible to connect Ethernet through an adapter or directly, then you can work with StayFi. Um, uh, and then someone asked if they have a group of 10 people in a house and not one person put in their email. In these cases where you're having specific issues of getting less data than you expect and you can't figure out why, definitely email support@stayfi.com because we'll be able to answer and figure out and go look at your specific access point, see the guests that have been on it, and understand the very specific scenario around what might be happening in that property. So definitely if you have like a very specific issue with a device, email support@stayfi.com. Someone asked about streaming, and we didn't cover this in the network. Well, I'll answer this about streaming and smart TVs regardless. So, when it comes to streaming, whether it's Sonos or a smart TV or Apple TV, those devices actually don't need to be on the same SSID or Wi-Fi network for guests to be able to stream on them. So for instance, if Sonos is connected to your home's original router and the guest is on the guest network broadcast by StayFi, you can actually still stream to Sonos from the guest device because they all are going back to the same router, which I know is a little bit counterintuitive, but is possible. One thing that we did launch recently is something called Smart Connect, which essentially allows devices that can't handle a captive portal like a smart TV or a Sonos to join our guest network automatically. So if you ever had the situation where a TV went off the internet and a guest tried to have it join the guest network and it didn't work because the TV can't use the captive portal and you had to give the guest the password, we've now solved that issue such that if the guest has the smart TV join the StayFi guest network, and now we'll let it on the guest network without using the splash page, so that those types of devices, whether they're gaming systems or TVs or thermostats, can now join the guest network and go around needing the splash page. We also put in place protection so that any device with a camera or microphone cannot do that. So there's some devices like a doorbell we don't let on because we want to prevent nefarious devices from joining the guest network. So as long as it's a generic device in a property that can't use a captive portal, but is pretty common and that we'd want to have join the guest network, those can now join the guest network automatically. And that's a feature we only rolled out in the last week. And then someone asks, when a guest enters an email, does StayFi confirm it's a legit email before allowing the guest to get access to the Wi-Fi? We do, using a tool called Zero Bounce. So essentially when the guest, and you have to turn the setting on in the settings of StayFi, but essentially we check with Zero Bounce, is this a real email? And then if it is a real email, we'll let them on. And if it's not a real email, we'll ask them to enter in a real email. Of course, we err on the side of letting people on to the Wi-Fi. So if Zero Bounce doesn't know whether it's real or not, and Zero Bounce has a great track record, but not every situation it knows. If it doesn't know whether it's real or not, we let them on the Wi-Fi. So almost 99% of the emails you collect through StayFi are not going to bounce, but there are a few scenarios where we just err on the side of letting people on the Wi-Fi when Zero Bounce doesn't know, just to make sure that you don't have any issues of guests trying to join with an email and they can't. So we always just want to reduce any friction so that you're not getting any complaints from guests they were unable to access the internet. Sweet. I think that is all the questions. And like I mentioned before, I know there are a ton of Wi-Fi related questions that we get that are very specific to your scenario. So again, encourage you to email support@stayfi.com with those questions. And then when it comes to this webinar, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So definitely check that out. I see we just got one more question, so I'll answer this quickly here. Yes, so on the splash page, someone's asking, do guests need to check consent to be marketed to? Yes, so in order to do marketing emails, we want to get consent from the guest. And so in that case, there will be a checkbox on the splash page. By default, it's actually pre-checked, so guests will have to affirmatively uncheck the email, uncheck the box in order to not be enrolled into marketing emails. It's important that you do this because if you don't give guests this option, it just increases the likelihood they'll unsubscribe or mark your email as spam, and that will damage your reputation as an email sender. So we want to protect you because if people really don't want to receive your emails, we want to give them that option, because if you end up sending them an email that they didn't want, there's a higher likelihood they'll mark it as spam or unsubscribe, which then can damage your email reputation. And if you damage your email reputation to a certain point, your emails might start going to spam in general. So we just want to prevent that from happening. So we definitely want to get that opt-in from guests to send marketing. And that's why if you use our marketing tool, we actually require that checkbox in some form, just to make sure we protect you from potentially hurting your overall email reputation. And then even your own emails sending to, outside of email marketing could even be potentially damaged from your domain. And we definitely don't want that to happen. Again, I know this was a different topic than we normally cover, so thanks again, everybody, for joining. Hope this was helpful in how to construct amazing Wi-Fi networks that give fantastic coverage. And we'll see you in 2 weeks to discuss the homepage, upselling, and then 2 weeks from then, we'll be talking about our new email marketing tool, which I'm so excited to present, so definitely check that out, because it's going to be an awesome upgrade to what we have today when it comes to generating emails to send to your guests. Thank you, everybody.